Good evening and welcome to the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this evening. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel for our program, Memorials for the Future. Earlier this year, the National Park Service, the National Capital Planning Commission, and the Van Alen Institute launched the Memorials for the Future Ideas Competition to explore new approaches to designing and experiencing memorials in the next century. Tonight, we'll examine possibilities for the next generation of commemoration, including areas of identity, narrative, placemaking, and innovative design. We're pleased to join with the Park Service, the NCPC, and the Van Alen Institute to bring you what promises to be a thoughtful and enlightening conversation. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to tell you about two programs that are coming up in this theater next week. On Friday, June 10th at noon, we'll screen a new documentary film, Jeremiah, which tells the story of Vietnam prisoner of war Jeremiah Denton. Following the screening, filmmakers Mark Festoso and Luis Blandon, along with James S. Denton, son of Jeremiah Denton and editor of World Affairs, will discuss the film and answer audience questions. And on Wednesday, June 15th at noon, we'll present a special Father's Day program as author Joshua Kendall will discuss and sign his new book, First Dads, Parenting and Politics from George Washington to Barack Obama. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it in regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. And a little known secret that I keep telling everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. Washington is a city of monuments and memorials, many within easy walking distance of where we are tonight. Plans for a monument to George Washington began during the earliest days of the federal city, and the styles and types of memorials reflect the tastes and mindsets of the years since then. The planning and building of these monuments and memorials is documented in the records held here at the National Archives, in the records of the Office of Public Buildings and Public Parks of the National Capital. In addition to constructing and maintaining public buildings and parks in the district, the office erected, maintained, and sometimes designed national monuments, statues, and memorials here. The architect of this building, John Russell Pope, is well represented in this collection of records. 20 years before Pope designed the National Archives building, he submitted designs for the Lincoln Memorial. Not only did he have several different designs, but he also planned for 3 different sites: the National Mall, Meridian Hill, and the grounds of the Soldiers' Home. In the end, architect Henry Bacon and the mall location got the nod for the Lincoln Memorial Commission. When we look at the familiar memorials, they appear permanent and unchanging. The alternate plans remind us that what we see today was not inevitable. Many minds come together to determine the final look of a memorial, and it's fascinating to look through those records to see what might have been. In the case of the iconic Lincoln Memorial, we might have had a pyramid or a funeral pyre instead of the Greek-style temple. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Bob Vogel, Director of the National Park Service's National Capital Region. A 35-year veteran of the National Park Service, he began his career as a seasonal park interpreter. His past positions at the Park Service include Superintendent of the National Mall and Memorial Parks and posts at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, Cape Lookout National Seashore in North Carolina, Guilford Courthouse National Military Park in North Carolina, Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site, and the Jamestown Flood National Memorial in Pennsylvania. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Vogel.
Good evening, and thank you, David. Thank you for hosting this evening's event. It's always a pleasure to be here. The National Park Service is very excited to partner with the National Capital Planning Commission and the Van Alen Institute to imagine what the future might hold for memorials here in Washington, D.C. And I want to especially thank Marcel Acosta. Marcel, as most of you know, is the Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission, who we have a great and long-standing relationship with, working together on commemoration plans and projects here in Washington. And it was Marcel's suggestion, he suggested this concept and called me up, and I thought, well, this sounds very exciting. So thank you, Marcel, and we always love to work with you. It's easy to think of Washington as formal, classical, and frankly, old-fashioned. But from the beginning, it has really been in many ways very forward-looking. Pierre L'Enfant's plan for the city placed the most important buildings at absurd distances and included a massive greens ward built on a swamp and captured views of buildings and monuments yet to be conceived. It took well more than a century for the essence of L'Enfant's vision to be realized, and of course that vision evolved as the city grew. But the core of Washington, the National Mall, has become the prime venue for the expression of truly what it means to be an American. We play here, we protest here, we celebrate here, and we remember here, we mourn here. It is only fitting that the National Mall is now home to many of our most important and treasured memorials. Many of these memorials were designed to make bold statements. Many were controversial. It seems like all of them, but I'll just say many were controversial. And certainly many were truly innovative. For example, when it was built, the Washington Monument was the tallest structure in the world, and it remains the tallest unreinforced masonry structure in the world. And of course, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial completely reinvented the War Memorial. These memorials and many others are now part of the landscape of Washington, an instantly recognizable, quintessentially American place, and also a national park. Well, the National Park Service is celebrating its centennial in 2016, and this important milestone gives us a moment to pause and reflect on our successes, to learn from our failures, and to envision a future for national parks. The National Park Service Centennial celebrates past achievements, but also kicks off a second century of stewardship for America's national parks. So more than ever, it's important that national parks inspire not only those who already know and love them, but also the next generation to ensure the preservation of our nation's majestic landscapes, our rich history, and our vibrant culture. While we are proud of our traditions, we also need to challenge ourselves to think creatively about the future. So as we look forward to our second century, we will continue to preserve and tell America's stories. And it is through these diverse stories and multiple perspectives that we can achieve our goals and remember important pieces of our shared history and collective memory. Memorials for the Future asks, what might that look like? In keeping with the visionary ideas that led to the National Mall and to so many of our treasured monuments, we hope that the innovative ideas generated through this competition will help all of us to reimagine the nature of commemoration and will enable the National Park Service to fulfill our mission in new and unexpected ways. More than ever, it's important that national parks inspire not only those who already know and love them, but also the next generation of park visitors, supporters, and advocates to ensure their preservation and critical relevancy to our nation's majestic landscapes, vibrant culture, then that they're protected and remembered for this and for future generations. So thank you again for joining us and helping us to celebrate and acknowledge the finalists for their amazing work and groundbreaking ideas. It is now my great pleasure to introduce David Vanderleer, who's the Executive Director of the Van Alen Institute, who is going to introduce our 4 finalists. Thank you much.
A very good evening, and thank you, Bob, for the introductions, and thank you to the Archives for hosting us. What a wonderful space, and great to see you all here tonight. I'm David Vanderleer, Executive Director for Van Alen Institute. Very briefly, we help governments and communities around the country finding solutions to some of the biggest challenges that they face. Sometimes big landscape issues, sometimes small public space interventions. And in this case, we're working through the concept of what can the memorials of the future be. It has been a very interesting process to work with the National Capital Planning Commission, and I thank Marcel and his team for the hard and enthusiastic work, as well as with the National Park Service on this exercise. A few weeks back now, we were here in the city and we chose out of initially 89 submissions, which we had already narrowed down to 30, a group of initially 10, and then by the end of the day we said, like, okay, we actually feel comfortable. We have 4 winning proposals that we're starting work with for the coming few weeks. A fantastic group of people. They're here tonight. We've been working with them today for the first day in our process. Smart people, creative people, and they represent a big group around the world. As I said, 89 teams, roughly 309 participants from several countries around the world. And I'm going to show you some slides for each of these proposals. The first proposal is the American Wilds, and I'm going to ask you to stand up briefly. I don't see the team so easily here. Here you go. This is the Lipschitz team, and they're looking at the infrastructure system here in the city, but using one of the most exciting things of the US, which I still find as a foreigner especially, your fantastic, beautiful landscapes in the national parks. So this is a proposal that will be developed further over the coming weeks. Then the second proposal of the Jensen team is a proposal in which we're looking at a cherry grove that will be, of course, here we go, blooming once a year, a nice annual celebration, but also an opportunity for us to realize that there's actually more happening than just spring happening every year. The waters are slowly going up, rising seawater levels, and this park will slowly go under. So an interesting way to, in a very poetic manner, show climate change happening. Then we have the Mohan team, which is looking at stories of migration, immigration, and what it means to make a new home in a new environment. So much more social proposal, and we're excited to see where we can take this with you over the coming weeks. And then last but not least, there is the Tranda Rescue team, and come on up. We're still thinking about a name for their project, but I think it's going to be something like a pandemonium. And what we're looking at here is the existing memorials in the city. How can you overlay a new narrative around these? And then there seems to be a flock of pink parrots that is involved, and we're trying to get to a full picture here also in the coming weeks. So please join me in welcoming these teams as a great group of finalists. As I mentioned, we'll be working with these teams for the next 2 months. It's an active process between MPS, NCPC, and Van Alen Institute, guiding all of these fantastic teams to more than we currently see here on the screen. Good, then the last, but certainly not least thing, I'm introducing our moderator tonight, who will be guiding you through the evening. Jason Schupbach, he's the Director of Design Programs at the National Endowment of the Arts. Jason is not only a very smart moderator, but he's also one of the funniest moderators I know. So, Jason, over to you.
Bring our panelists up here. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? Yes, great. Well, good evening, everybody. Wow, total silence. That was awesome. Did we all have a glass of wine before coming? Good evening, everyone. Let's try that again. Hi, everybody. Yeah, awesome. Hand clap. Great. Well, your guys are in for a really special treat because we have 3 of the smartest people I know that are going to talk about what does the future of memorials really look like. What we're going to do is have each of them do a really short speech just to give us a little bit of context of their work and to talk about the topic at hand. And then we're going to have a little discussion amongst ourselves for about 20 minutes, and then we will take questions from you guys. So I hope everyone heard about the instructions of writing questions down on cards. So I will, after their speeches, ask you to please pass those cards down to the end, and we'll have those collected up, and then we'll be able to use those questions later on. Make sense? Okay, so I'm going to initially pass it off to the brilliant Ed Linenthal, who's one of the, am I allowed to say this? One of the nation's absolute experts in memorialization, has written a lot of really incredible books on this. You've all got his bio. I'm not going to go over it. So Ed, why don't you kick us off for the evening?
Thank you. A student more than an expert. So it's wonderful.
Andy's so modest.
It's wonderful to be here tonight, and especially to see old friends from the Park Service that I hadn't seen in a while. And this will be a really interesting test because Jason asked a professor to only speak for 5 to 7 minutes. This is something unheard of in the annals of humankind, but we'll see how it goes. So when I looked through the 30 finalists, I was really stunned and felt very much, I'm going to probably date myself, like a sort of a 2-dimensional person in a multi-dimensional world, because I'm so rooted in the idea of memorials and place and the transformation of place and space. But these were stunningly interesting, and it reminded me of James Young's brilliant work, my friend and colleague James Young, Holocaust Memorials, of the whole generation of German memorial artists that are suspicious of traditional monumental form as inherently authoritarian. And so they have these sort of breathtaking projects where memorials disappear into the ground slowly and the visitor is left, and the message, of course, is, memorials can't do the remembering for you. You have to do the remembering. And memorials that go out into communities in the way some of these did to braid acts of remembrance together. And James, I think quite correctly, brings in a term that I like very much of collected memories rather than collective memories, because it is, in fact, our collected memories, often in contest with one another, that are the multiple voices with which a memorial speaks. The conceit that a monument or a memorial speaks with one voice, of course, has always been illusory. Now we're just conscious of it and making it clear that there are so many different voices. So I found these really fascinating, people seeing in a different way. But the different variety now of memorial form is the functions are still in many ways the same. To inspire, always remember; cautionary, never forget. Certainly, at least with Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial; therapeutic, the vexing notion of memorials as healing and what that means. And with some of these projects, and particularly one of the finalists here, about memorializing the violence of environmental degradation, asking us to think about the aftermath of the present, which is an interesting kind of addition to what a memorial means, adding, it seems to me, another function of memorial as lamentation. So we have this diversity of memorial forms now, ethereal, not rooted necessarily in one place. I want to mention, however, though, being somewhat old-fashioned, that the traditional memorial landscape of the United States, and I'm thinking not only of the Park Service, but certainly of the Park Service, is dynamic in the same way that memorial form is dynamic. If you looked at the American historic landscape 50 years ago and look at it now, it's a sea change of difference. We recognize that women have been historical agents. There's a news flash, right? We have at least some mention in Lowell, Massachusetts, for example, that labor needs to be memorialized on the American landscape. We now memorialize some of the most indigestible stories of American history, spectacle lynching, for example, the incarceration of Americans of Japanese ancestry, most recently, Sand Creek. But it's not only these indigestible stories that are now a part of the landscape, but an expansion of who counts, who gets to be included. And this, I think, is an ongoing process. We also have now a compression between an event and a memorialization of an event. Flight 93, for example, which I was on the Federal Commission for almost a decade, takes place very soon after and brings with it a particular kinds of sensitivities of memorials that are done with, for example, family members included. I don't know that it's better or worse than waiting 50 years, but it brings a different kind of sensibility. These are all issues I'm happy to talk more about in our discussion. Finally, let me just say that one of the things that I found particularly striking in my work on Oklahoma City and on Flight 93 was the democratization of memorial processes. And that shows in some ways here that all kinds of folks are now thinking about how to do memorials. It's not just a top-down production. I mean, at Oklahoma City, the Memorial Task Force came together in July 1995, 3 months after the bombing murdered 168 people and wounded hundreds more. Mostly family members, people in the community at first, eventually survivors who came out of the building. And they came together, many of them thinking, only this design can really honor my loved one. Only 168 hearts, only 168 trees, only 168 something or other. And they were vested in that as the only way that this memorial would work. But they came together and realized that none of those individual visions could take place because everybody had them and everybody was so convicted. So they had to come together and really practice the arts of democracy to reach a vision of community that I found absolutely breathtaking for a community that had been shattered so much. Very much the same way in Flight 93. So the democratization of memorial processes, I think, is one of the really fascinating and moving parts of this whole business. So with that, I'm going to stop.
Okay, it's almost like you wrote a book on it, which he did, several. That was awesome, thank you. Next we have Brent Leggs from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who's been working for many, many years on issues around African American history and memorialization, which we're really excited to have you here to talk to us about a little bit tonight. So take it away, Brent.
Thank you.
Do you have your slides clicker?
I do,
Great.
yes. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
It's nighttime.
All right. Well, I am excited to be here to share my work with you today. So African American Historic Places reminds me of a beautiful quote from the movie Eve's Bayou. Memory is a selection of images, some elusive, others printed indelibly on the brain. Each image is like a tapestry of intricate texture, and the tapestry tells a story, and the story is our past. By preserving Black culture in its material form, I believe that we bring to life the African American experience and broaden our understanding of American history. I believe that Black culture, Black spaces, and Black landscapes matter, that African American sites of memory matter, that our collected or collective identity as a nation matters. Our culture is embodied in old buildings and the stories they keep. There is power in identity. When I was in graduate school at the University of Kentucky, I had the good fortune to conduct the statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools. Rosenwald Schools represents a massive school building program that was developed by Booker T. Washington and funded by philanthropist Julius Rosenwald. Together, they helped to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. During this process, I learned that my mother and father attended Rosenwald schools. As you can imagine, I had a connection to iconic figures in history and the past like never before. And I also had this multi-dimensional experience with these places. I could see, I could touch, I could smell, I could hear the creaking floorboards as I walked inside these often forgotten and abandoned buildings. But there also was this sixth sense, a transcendent quality. I began to understand the quiet power of historic preservation to bring the past into the present, unlike any other form of history. That was powerful for me. I also realized that Booker T. Washington's vision for uplifting the Black community was real, it was ongoing, and had directly impacted my life. So preservation makes Washington's and Rosenwald's lives once lived real. So in my work, I have had the good fortune to work at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We have a signature program called National Treasures. Currently, we have a revolving portfolio of 60 places around the country. And I'm proud to say that 20% of our portfolio directly reflects African American history. And I categorize this into two different areas: intentional monuments and unintentional monuments. In Irvington, New York, stands a beautifully restored historic residence that embodies the optimism and perseverance of American entrepreneurship. Villa Lawaro is the home of America's first self-made female millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker. She constructed this beautiful Italianate mansion in 1918, costing $250,000. Wow. She has a lot of stories, but I love one where she said that when her husband thought that she should be satisfied with making $10 a day, due to his narrowness of vision, she embarked upon business for herself. Did y'all just hear that? Due to his narrowness of vision, she embarked upon business for herself. I think every little girl in America should hear that story. The National Trust is working with Ambassador Harold E. Doley Jr. and his wife Helena to protect the house in perpetuity with a conservation and preservation easement. Look at the beauty of this. It was designed by Vertner Tandy, who is the first licensed Black architect in the state of New York. Howard University, Founders Library. This is one of our newest national treasures. A lot of folks don't realize that Howard University's law school was housed in Founders Library. The intellectual architects that dismantled our segregated educational system, that took place here. So this is a historic monument to the intellectual creativity of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. And this building was designed by a pioneering Black architect, Albert Cassell. So unintentional monuments. Part of the reconstructing identity is to look beyond the aesthetic value that we hold dear in historic preservation, and it is starting to honor places that are unadorned, that are small, that are vernacular buildings, but if you take a second glance, you realize that they hold exceptional beauty and meaning. Places like the childhood home of Pauli Murray. Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. She was a co-founder of the National Organization of Women, the first African-American Episcopal saint, a trailblazing feminist. And the National Trust is working with local organizations to turn this house into the Pauli Murray Institute for Social Justice. The A.G. Gaston Motel that's in Birmingham, Alabama. A lot of folks don't realize that during April and May of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Shuttlesworth, and Abernathy held a war room here. They devised the strategy for Project C, which was the nonviolent protest movement. Dr. King led the march from the A.G. Gaston Motel to City Hall, where he would get arrested and eventually write a letter from a Birmingham jail. This place matters. This place is a historic monument, not only to civil rights, but to entrepreneurship. A.G. Gaston was the most successful African-American entrepreneur in the state of Alabama at that time, passed away in 1996 with a net worth of $130 million. The National Trust is working with a coalition of partners, including Congresswoman Terry Sewell, to protect the A.G. Gaston Motel, 16th Street Baptist Church, other landmarks, to become a part of the National Park Service, which we're calling the Birmingham Civil Rights National Historical Park. And then the last is John Coltrane House, that's in Dix Hills, Long Island. This is where John Coltrane considered his greatest composition, A Love Supreme, and recorded it in the studio in the basement. It's a simple structure, but it holds a lot of meaning, and again, is a historic monument to the creativity of Americans and to celebrate an art form that we created, which is jazz. And we're exploring a partnership with the Friends of the John Coltrane Home, and more to come on that. So just in closing, my work is about reconstructing our national identity. I want to balance our public memories. The Black experience is so rooted in 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal. But what about the balance? Can we say places that are of sites of achievement, sites of architecture, sites of activism? Historic preservation is a tool that we use to reconstruct identity, to tell new stories, and most importantly, to have a positive impact on people's lives. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Last but not least, we have the internationally famous now artist, Janet Echelman. If any of you have been to the Renwick, to the Wonder Show, she had the big hanging piece upstairs in the back, which is awesome. Janet's going to tell us about some of her pieces that she's done around the world that are related to memorialization. I think we're going to start with some video that you're ready to cue whenever you like.
As an artist, as I listen, I realize that I'm focused on questions. I don't have the answers, and that's my practice, is the way of discovering and finding my way through them. Something Brent said about bringing past into the present, I think that's very much at the core. And I brought some video of 3 projects in 3 different countries to show you. The first will be about the question of how do you remember the tsunami that hit Fukushima, Japan. And this project is in London, and that will be followed by a project in Boston. And I'll tell you about those as they come, and then Vancouver, Canada. So let's roll the video. Maybe as we get ready to roll the video, I'll tell you about Boston. Boston
here's the video.
is, here we go, London. So I began looking at, the monitor's not showing it. I began looking at the tsunami and the data from the NOAA and this measurement of the impact as it rippled across the ocean, thinking about interconnectedness and the way that we are all interrelated in ways we know and some that are unseen. This is lifting the work into place. This is the busiest intersection in all of London, which we closed down for 4 nights, and the work was pulled into space. The name is 1.8, and that refers to the amount of time the Earth's day was sped up by that event. We don't think about the effects of time on these kinds of events. We think only about human individuals. And the work is very much about a constant change and the interconnectedness of every single node with one another. As one part moves with the wind and with light, every other node is affected by it. The work was brought out above your head as you came out of the subway here, and oh, here it is going away, and people could interact with it, and I'll tell you more about the interactivity. So the second project, as if we were already here, this is the middle of downtown Boston, where there was once a highway, and the Big Dig, the largest public works project in America, removed that highway and reflected our changing value from the automobile back to the pedestrian. And this is suspended in the same space of that highway. The lines began by being measured out by the lanes of that highway. And the color actually reflects the rust that that green highway had become before it was removed. And it is literally a physical manifestation of our interconnectedness in that it's connected into the structure of each of the buildings of our city. That energy that's already invested in our cities is now being used to bring people together. And the wind becomes an active player. And after one of the waiters who worked in the restaurant at the base of that tower told me that every night after his shift, he would go and lie down in the grass and look up and watch the colors very slowly change. And that is the way that I am answering this question. How do you bring the past into the present? And remembering urban culture. So this is downtown Vancouver. I was asked to think about the history of cities, and I looked at Rome and the Colosseum. 2,000 years ago, the Colosseum had a canvas structure suspended from ropes, and I took that question. It was called a velarium. What would a velarium for today be? What is a memorial for today? Instead of watching violent spectacle, we come together to share ideas. And so here we are. This is the custom software I needed to develop to make these structures. This is the largest, that's reality, the largest pre-stressed rope structure in the world. And I collaborated with the private sector. This is Google created this software where anybody on any cell phone could make a gesture with their hand, and it's projected onto the surface of the artwork. So it's a virtual reality and a physical reality bridged into one. And it was a way for people to connect with people they didn't know, because here you are interacting and suddenly you're talking to the person next to you. And I'm closing with an image from Washington, D.C., which you're all invited to visit at your leisure. So I just wanted to close with this thought about the question of how do we create a collective memory? We're talking about collected memories, but how do we create an experience that links us together, that bridges across age, across race, across education? How do we create an experience that pulls people in and gives them just enough to begin to contemplate these questions and take it in their own way of creating meaning? And this last image, I guess Jason was mentioning that this exhibit at the Renwick Gallery, which has been having lines around the block and Instagram, the Washington Post wrote an article about how much, social media, like this is a part of how we are creating meaning today in our culture. And so offering ways for people to participate in creating their own meaning through photography is certainly something that is part of our time.
Thank you. Before we move on, Janet's being super modest about how difficult her works are to do, and I just wanted her to talk about it for 2 seconds.
Sure.
How the Boston project, which might have been funded by the NEA, I don't know, but we did. To just talk about how much rope was used and how many knots were in it.
So it's 100 miles of rope. Oh, man. And I think it's 500,000 knots. And the forces, that, it's important that it looks incredibly delicate, but it's fiercely strong. It withstands 100,000 pounds of force at a single point as it reaches up to the top of a skyscraper. So we had to close down the road. Those are 7 cranes, the largest being 100 tons.
Wow. I thought it's just cool to know that. I mean, it's like, you know, well. Okay, we're going to get into this. I want to remind you that if you would like to ask a question, to please start writing those down now and handing them down the aisle, because that's how we're going to take questions from the crowd. So make sure you're doing that now. Those will be collected now. So I think our goal tonight is to kind of talk on the 3 big topics that NCPC and the Park Service and Van Alen want us to talk about, which is really identity, memory, and placemaking. So I just heard identity coming out of the pores of your guys' presentations. So let's start with that. And almost the question that Janet asked at the end, I think, is really the first question we should start with, which is, how do we advance dialogue about contemporary social, economic, health issues that have historical roots through memorialization, right? What is the contemporary role for memorialization? We'll talk about reinterpreting all memorials in a second, but what is the contemporary role that can engage our very diverse society? What's the best way that you think that we need to go forward with this, how we can help guide this for our nation's capital? This is a big deal conversation, people. You know, like this is about the future of memorialization in our nation's capital, so we need to get into it.
Just repeat that: identity, memory, and
placemaking.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. So I've been thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and how can we take this current activism within urban populations and with our youth and relate that to historic preservation. So going back to Fort Monroe, for example. So in 1861, during the middle of Civil War, 3 enslaved Americans self-emancipated. They were declared contraband of the war by Union General Benjamin Butler. That story needs to be told, because when you start to layer the collective experiences and the activism within the Black community, the Black Lives Matter movement isn't new. It started before Fort Monroe, but Fort Monroe, you can look at A.G. Gaston Motel, you can look at Founders Library, you can look at Pauli Murray's house. All of these places together begins to tell a story of the activism and that Black bodies, Black lives have always mattered. And I think if we can again kind of connect history to contemporary issues, then we become a relevant movement.
Ed, do you want to jump in here?
A couple of thoughts. One is that certainly some of the most provocative museums, I think first of all of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, are not only memorials now, but museums. And this gets tricky when you're a memorial museum, when you try and combine commemorative language and historic language. But they're also forums that address these kinds of contemporary things. Lots of natural history museums now are forums that address all kinds of issues of environmental degradation. It also seems to me that one of the ways you begin to deepen identity is to awaken a moral imagination by putting yourself in someone else's shoes, a kind of habitable history, if you will. So when you go to a plantation that had slaves, not servants as they used to be called, but slaves, you don't walk in the front door and think about the furniture and think about who lived there. You go in the kitchen door and you think about the house from a very different perspective. Your whole gaze has changed. I mean, where you look from depends, or what you see depends on where you look from. I mean, just entering a plantation from the kitchen door, thinking about the slaves that entered chambers pots, thinking about where they lived in comparison to the big house, is a way, I think, imaginatively of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. The kinds of really exciting archaeological projects that are going on all over. For example, at Monticello, about resurrecting African-American lives there, restoring a sense of agency, is a way of I think deepening identity and introducing a sense of humility into our national story.
Janet, do you want to jump in here? How is really the role of identity and played into the narrative of your pieces? How have you worked to make them inclusive when you've done your work?
Well, I have a permanent work opening in Greensboro, North Carolina this summer. And the question of like how to address the way that communities have come together there as the railroads came together there historically is something that is woven into that piece, which you can see after August. Climate change is something that you were showing before, and I think it's a very, I think what I bring to this question is a point of view about tone, because how do you speak to the issues of our climate without being dogmatic? How do you do it in a way that opens a space to think without shutting us down, that is open-ended, that isn't telling you what to think, but is placing certain things there? And I've found this working with data and my own personal experience of being confounded by it, that like the process of making the work and shaping the work and sharing it is bringing, it's bringing you in to that question without telling you what the answer should be.
I think this is really helpful for the teams that are going to be working on this. Let's dwell a little bit on the topic of process and identity. It's sort of the who gets to memorialize question, right? So I know both you, Brent, and Ed have looked at this question quite a bit, and I would love to hear how would you advise the teams here to begin thinking about the who question in their process going forward? So take it away.
Well,
Super easy, right?
Yeah, well, I think we all know that we have to be an inclusive movement, and all of our processes should be welcoming and opening to people from different communities. As artists and as preservation practitioners, different perspectives adds value to our work. That's why when I think about Project Row Houses that's in Houston, Texas, and artist Rick Lowe and what he's been able to do, based upon a painting of shotgun row houses, to be able to create a cultural institution that has revitalized a blighted, historic African-American community. Or thinking about artist Theaster Gates and creating ethical redevelopment principles, these 9 principles that talks about the community engagement piece, that talks about beauty, processes, and has revitalized a neighborhood that has faced years of disinvestment, and they have leveraged culture to be able to reinvent historic spaces, but most importantly, they have leveraged the existing community. And if you can think about that in your work, then again, I think that we can remain a relevant institution moving forward.
You want to jump in here?
So yeah, I'm thinking about some years ago when I was on the original advisory commission for the ill-fated Enola Gay exhibition at the National Air and Space Museum. See how well I did with that one. And I tried with absolutely no success at all to convince journalists that controversy didn't mean something was wrong. It meant people were passionately engaged, right? I mean, if all of us in this room were on a memorial commission to memorialize something none of us cared about, it would be really easy, right? Where should it go? I don't care. What should it look like? I don't care. But if we were all deeply invested in it, it would be a much more difficult thing. And I've never quite understood, there seems to be the sense that the process is supposed to be easy. And that's a kind of dopey assumption. I mean, wouldn't we all sort of feel uneasy if we said, oh, yeah, sure, a Holocaust museum, yeah, we'll knock that out in a couple of weeks. I mean, it should be agonizing when you do these kinds of things. James Young, who is on the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, has this wonderful line. in something that he wrote that I think about a lot, and that is that perhaps there should never be a final solution to the German Holocaust memorial question. So that process kind of, always goes on, and it's fascinating, I think, to see. Yeah.
But I've seen some people say the process itself is a memorial, which is interesting. So teams,
Yeah.
get ready for agony, right? And what was the term he used, like crazy enthusiasm or something? Yeah. Anyways, let's get into memory a little bit. So I think it's really interesting that a lot of the teams are looking at memorializing something we're still living through, or something that takes a long time, like global warming. What are you seeing out there about the best ways to kind of do that? What kind of pitfalls do you think that people might step into? I'd love to just hear you guys talk about that, or any other processes I guess we're all living through history at the same moment, but when you're trying to memorialize something that isn't necessarily totally present yet, or might be occurring to us right now, how do you deal with the presence of the present? Do you want to jump in?
Well, I don't want to give any advice to anybody, but it seems to me some of the challenges are context. I mean, we pick contexts as well. So what are the contexts that are most compelling and most evocative? There's a strength in memorializing something that's still going on. It's real, it's visceral, it's alive. It's also being in the middle of something and maybe being painfully conscious that you're in a stream and you're picking a moment in that stream and leaving it open-ended enough that people inhabit this memorial space, whatever it is, so that it's open-ended, so that the memorial deepens questions and doesn't end them.
So Janet, you experienced this. You did something right after an event, right? The piece in London was pretty much, they were still in recovery from, they're still in recovery now from the tsunami. How did you kind of work with that presence of the present? I like my little term I just made up. And how was it, to kill a word, present there in London, even so far from Japan, in the space when people were looking at the piece? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, for me, I'm thinking about effects and our interconnectedness. So even as we're breathing, if that image I was showing you was radioactivity spreading. I mean, I think my work is trying to bring the layers that are present that we don't see. These things are happening around us. It's just they're out of mind because they're not visible. The other thing is, it's important to speak to a group that is already following your message, but I think the challenge I'm often trying to take on is not to preach to the converted, but to expand that question to let others in and let them feel included and to have a right to be part of that history. So that we are all humans, and we are all breathing this air, and we are all to blame as well as victims. And how do we open up that conversation without diluting it or minimizing its truth? But also, if we stay only in that smallness, then we don't harness the power, the collective power that can happen, like what we really want this to mean for change, and whether it's a Holocaust memorial or a civil rights memorial or talking about the nuclear movement or climate change. And so that is the challenge I'm taking on, and I don't have a solution yet, but I think it's important to engage in how we can cut across and beyond boundaries of all sorts.
And I'll just say quickly that public memory, like time, is always changing. And what I'm wanting to do with my work at Villa Lawaro, Madam C.J. Walker's estate, is to resurrect this cultural ethic for historic preservation within the Black community. So a lot of folks don't realize that Madam Walker bequeathed her property to the NAACP, helped to sustain the organization during the Great Depression. It's a great example of planned giving to support cultural institutions. Today, Ambassador Doley being an amazing steward. And then Sundial Brands, the founder, Rich Dennis Liu, has acquired Madam Walker's legacy business. This is a beautiful intersection between the intangible and tangible heritage. And yet, I think African Americans of means have forgotten that this has been part of our ethic, that we are preservationists, that we care about the built environment and the stories that they keep. And I'm hoping to use this as an example to shift public memory.
Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about reinterpretation of existing memorials. You know, there's a lot of white men on soldiers in this town. I mean, white soldiers on horses in this town. You know, up on plinths. Look at them; they're so important. Nothing against white men, but
Or horses.
or horses. Gotta love a horse. They have those cool hats too most of the time because they were like generals or whatever. I'm super into war history, as you can tell. So the pink parrots proposal, right, I think is a really fun way to talk about the issue of reinterpretation and how you actually get people to see, or in a creative way, think about the alternate history of a space. So I'd love to hear you talk about this, Ed. I think this is a really key issue. Look at what's going on with the Confederate memorials in the South right now, really hot topic. Yep. If those things are going to stay as a part of our history, and memorials are going to, how do we keep them present and round out the conversation around them for our contemporary society?
Yeah, well, one of the things we have to do is to take away the toxicity around the word revisionism. This originally, of course, people talked about Holocaust revisionism. Well, that's not, it was Holocaust denial. Right? If any of you have children, let's say you have a child that's in college, would you want his or her professor to say, well, after the Soviet Union fell, all of these archives opened up that allow us to understand the Holocaust in Eastern Europe in ways we never had before. I know the languages, I could go and do that and bring all of that back to my classes, but doggone it, I would have to revise stuff, and that would make me a revisionist. So let's just stick with the old way of doing it. I mean, I doubt you think that your child was getting their money's worth. Any historian who's not senile is by definition a revisionist. We don't look at George Washington through the eyes of Parson Weems. So to revise whatever story it is, we're bringing new questions, new materials come out. People look at things with new eyes. There's no other field except history and historical interpretation in which the term revision is looked upon in this way. I mean, when you go to a doctor you don't recoil when the doctor doesn't put leeches on your arm and say, my God, I'm going to a medical revisionist. But here, this is a real problem, right? Because the epithet is thrown. Well, you're revising. So to put up a wayside to explain the history of why this Black Mammy memorial was put up in Harper's Ferry is a way of secularizing it, is a way of revising our understanding of it. One of the case studies that I loved writing about, and it's one of the best ones that I know, is at the Little Bighorn. All right, the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. And the Park Service over several generations has transformed this place from a shrine to George Armstrong Custer in the 7th Cavalry to an American historic site in which various groups of Americans are remembered, and the presence of the Indian Memorial changes the physical landscape and introduces now a plurality of memory. Now that is a revision. And part of the problem here is that our first interpretation of something is so rooted, it seems as if it's part of the natural order of things, right? Rather than a first interpretation. And you have a clue whenever you hear somebody say, it's a well-known fact. And whenever somebody says that, you know they're talking about a first interpretation and they don't want to move on. So this is, I think, a really crucial thing to think about as we think about reinterpretation of all these things.
Well, it's a well-known fact Janet is a good artist, so no, just kidding. I'm choking. I would love to hear you talk about what you feel like the role of the artist is in reinterpretation, or bringing kind of a different presence and a different lens to maybe a historical.
Well, even to think about, like, how do I bring a different lens to the question of, like, a lot of bronze horses with soldiers on top?
Right.
Like, we have fought for how many years what a memorial looks like. It's on the ground. Let's start with that. Even when, the World War II memorial doesn't really look very different than memorials have looked for a really long time. And how we make symbolism, but this very basic reality of a plinth and an object. And for me, it's so central to the way the lens I look through is to adapt and respond to what is there. So it's all about a response to the ability of what the city has made, what has already been invested in it. My works are custom made to the millimeter, to attach between and to the load-bearing capacity of the cities we've already built. And how do we find new experiences and new spaces? The whole idea of what placemaking is. Like, where is it? And for me, it's the invisible spaces, the things between things that they're not noted on maps because it's just the negative space. And how, it seems to me like this isn't this untapped resource. And so that is the lens that I've been bringing to placemaking.
Cool. I'd love to get to placemaking in just a sec, so thanks for bringing that up. That'd be great. I want Brent to get in here on, you actually talked quite a bit on reinterpretation or just interpretation of sites that people maybe haven't thought about. How do you think about, even in the going to those sites and trying to raise their history, about the multiple histories that might surround them too? How are you kind of pulling that into your work right now?
Yeah. So what I do first is ask myself, what is the purpose of my work? And what I mean by that is, what's the impact? Who are we trying to reach and for what purpose? And I think when you start to ask yourselves those kind of questions, then you can start to tailor an interpretation strategy that has greater meaning. And as I shared in my introductory remarks, I'm focused on balancing public memory, thinking about reconstructing identity, telling those multiple stories, whether it's the story of Villa Lawaro and planned giving, so that we can start to think about the economic sustainability of historic preservation, or the dual themes like at A.G. Gaston Motel. It's just not a site connected to civil rights. It's a story about entrepreneurship, which is undertold and needs to be celebrated, because my goal through this work is to inspire the next generation of achievers and entrepreneurs. And I think if we start to take a step back and think about impact, that's the starting point.
Well, great. Well, let's get a little into placemaking, and then we'll go to questions in the crowd. Are you guys ready? Cool. I'll take them. Please hand them to me. Thank you. Wow, there's just a few. How late do you guys want to stay? Let's get into placemaking just for a second. So we're kind of out of room on the mall for memorials, if you haven't noticed. So the big issue that NCPC really wants to talk about is, how can you balance physical memorials out in the city and the neighborhoods, right? Be temporary or permanent. What do they need? What do folks need to be thinking about? And I think many of the teams are talking about doing sites that are not necessarily on the mall. That was one of their instructions. What are the key things they really need to keep in mind as they're out there engaging? And these are places where people live every day, not necessarily as visiting as a tourist, or not in the kind of memorial heart of the city. When it's in a neighborhood, what's different? Ed?
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I have a question about that, though, that I'll be interested in others talking, and then the panelists to think about too. So we've talked at the Journal of American History for a long time. We do 600 book reviews a year. That's all we can do in the pages of the journal. And so we've talked about, well, what about if we did a lot more book reviews online? And the problem there is that those become second-class citizens, right? They're not in the print journal. And I've thought about this with regard to hierarchy of space. And this is one place where memorials processes often get into trouble. I mean, hierarchies are differences that are supposed to make a difference. Who gets remembered, where they get remembered, how they get remembered, all of those kinds of questions. I mean, to be memorialized physically on or near the mall imparts a kind of prestige that I don't know you can recreate anywhere else. I mean, it gives you a clue to the significance of the memory. It means something that the Holocaust Museum is adjacent to the Washington Mall and not next to a burger place off an on-ramp in Virginia. So is there a way that memorials now that are not physically privileged in this memorial core can be viewed, experienced with the same kind of import? You know, that they're as important or potentially as important, or is there by definition of kind of hierarchy that will relegate them to a second-class status?
Brent?
Yeah, I just want the public to see that historic preservation, you know, our whole purpose of saving old buildings is because they stand on the landscape as permanent, lasting memorials. They are the exhibit. And then when you mark spaces, that's why I love historic marker programs. One, they're inexpensive, but they allow us, when we interact in the physical realm and on the streets, that it makes us pause for a second. History lives here. Something important happened here. And we can mark spaces in many different ways. In Lexington, Kentucky, artists painted horses, and they had them on the street corners all around. There were 38 horses that were beautifully designed by all of these various artists to celebrate the heritage, horsing legacy and heritage in Lexington, Kentucky. You know, can we do something innovative and creative like that, that again marks spaces and keeps our history in public's memory?
Janet, you do a lot of projects in lots of spaces. What about when you're what's the difference between a memorial core and a neighborhood?
Well, in terms of placemaking, I think, well, a couple of things. There is no project that I do that is not about memory, in a way, because the work is about place and what it means, and that inevitably brings us into history, and often there are multiple histories in a place. And then how do I weave that together? But I think in the context of this discussion about the mall and the politics and value accrued by your location, I think one of the solutions is to do temporary works. Because then you can, in fact, enliven and occupy a highly important space, and then it is gone. And that memory lives on, and it is part of historical dialogue through its photographs. So I think that is an important, you know, it's the majority of my practice are enduring permanent works. But these temporary works are a way, you know, I couldn't shut down the busiest street in London always, but I could for 4 nights completely change the way people felt about their city. It was the coldest week of the year, and people were lying on the raw asphalt, shivering. But just to have the streets to them, to have a moment of contemplation, to think about their connection to other parts of the world and one another. So I think that may be a strategy. It's not the only strategy to be used, but it certainly would really expand the ability to do really monumental attention-holding work. And I think that's sort of an untapped area in the Capitol.
Well, the first question is actually about temporary memorials.
Oh.
How perfect. Temporary memorials quite frequently have a sense of urgency and uniqueness. How can permanent memorials be reinvigorated like temporary installations after the initial excitement of their opening and dedication?
All right, so I've been thinking that historic preservationists, that in many ways we are artists. So the landscape is our canvas, the materials is the building, and the art that we create are the human interactions within the physical space. And that's where we need to focus our attention, is how can we create human interaction that allows the public to want to revisit this space multiple times. You know, that then leads to the economic sustainability of historic places. And we need to be better at creating that interaction.
Anyone else on this?
I'm just thinking about the stories about what people told me about the Boston sculpture I showed you and what it meant to them, and that they kept coming back over and over. They wanted to, once they saw somebody post an image of it in the rain, then they wanted to be there in the rain. And that, you know, like there's something about works that by their physical presence are changing and ephemeral and adapting to the natural forces that are always changing, the sun, the wind. And then there are these additional levels of, you know, if there are like the piece in London, on your phone, you could select a color and the piece slowly changed to that color. It actually calculated like, you know, like a communal mood ring. So you could watch it change as people were selecting that. So there are many new tools we have to create this sense of fluidity, but then there are these physical reality of the forces around us that also, you know, if we build in a way that can adapt.
So there's a few questions here really asking about youth audiences and how we engage them in memorials that they don't necessarily have a historical connection to. So I'd love to hear you guys kind of talk about that. I mean, specifically, how do we better engage young people in marginalized communities, so not just youth, but maybe a community that hasn't been engaged in the particular history that's being represented in the kind of placemaking of the memorial today. So maybe we can frame this around for the teams themselves. How can they make sure that they're really reaching out and engaging the full community that needs to be involved in their process?
Well, I think youth engagement is very important. And I think a starting point is just to convene some kids and ask them the meaning of a place. See what kind of ideas they might share. And then once the memorial is actually in place, could they then be the docents? Can they be the ones that takes folks around and leads a tour, that writes a script about the history, that builds their professional skill sets and allows them to really be immersed in the history, even if it's not part of their families or their personal identity?
Great, thank you. This is a good one for you. Understanding that the prospect of commemorization is a collected experience, what is the role of the audience in the process? Apart from observer, do the future memorials understand or interpret the audience as a participant?
Can you read that last part again?
Okay, it's basically asking about how do we make sure that in the collected experience that the audience is really involved in the process.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear you guys on this too. So you both had real experience with this.
What happened in Oklahoma City?
Yeah, what happens in Oklahoma City? Well, I mean, I think this is a real question. You know, we don't really know what audiences take away. There's more sophisticated work now, you know, but in some ways, I think audiences are trapped by certain kinds of language that they think they're expected to say. At the Holocaust Museum, for example, when I went through visitor responses many years ago now, I mean, it was trapped with the kind of formulaic "never again," right? Or "I really enjoyed my visit." Well, I know what they meant. I mean, you know, they meant it was very powerful, but that's, you know, that's what people say. Well, I mean, it's not "never again." It's "will it ever stop?" But I think exhibits and historic sites have to respect visitors bringing all kinds of different stuff, and I think there's a huge opportunity not to make the hidden curatorial voice of any interpretive expression that which ends the questioning, all right? But awakens visitors' moral imagination. Say, wow, I've never thought about that, or these questions that this place posed for me are really interesting. You know, I would really like to read more. Oh, there's a gift shop here that has books. So that, you know, allowing the audience to inhabit the space is really important. When we were doing a lot of the educational stuff at Flight 93, some of the Park Service language I objected to in our phone calls, because it was kind of, this is what the visitor will experience at this place in Flight 93. I said, well, how the hell do you know what the visitor is going to experience there? Why are we, there's a Park Service in the business now of marshaling emotions. You know, visitors are going to experience this place in all kinds of different ways. And in some ways, you have to trust the audience. There are no doubt people that go into the Holocaust Museum and go, man, I wish he would have finished the job, right? There are many people that go there and come out with the same kind of surface, you know, trivial kind of understanding. Well, if you're going to put this stuff into the public, people are going to do with it what they will. All you can do is put forth the best, most challenging stuff, and I think leave people with questions that ask them to go deeper.
Go ahead.
This question is about participation, and I'm thinking also the last one about youth and teenagers. I don't always know how people are going to engage, but the installation at the Renwick Gallery, anytime I've spoken to someone in Washington, they've told me that it's their teenagers who have told them about it. That it's all coming from from younger people and then spreading up in terms of age. And in that piece, I created my first carpet because there were all these constraints on the space. It's used for all kinds of functions, so I had to leave it open between 0 feet and 14 feet. So, of course, I had to use every wall for these projected shadow drawings that are changing over the course of a full hour, and the floor and the ceiling. And I didn't know that people would decide to lie down on the carpet. But it's turned out that it's become a contemplative space where people come and they really stay and watch the changing shadow drawings, and they stay and have their own thoughts, and that they are participating by making their images and writing the words that go with them. One of the Instagram people posts said, melting with the exhibit as we become part of the art. And it was a woman and her child like lying on the carpet, and I just thought these memorials need to be more than exhibits about something. They need to somehow bring us into a present moment experience.
Did all the teams
So
get that?
multi-sensory experiences when you can do it.
When.
Right? Can you talk a little about the aftermath of the London exhibition? What people were talking about, or were people still going there after this came down and thinking and visualizing? Do you know much about the kind of afterlife of that?
There's been a lot of afterlife in the sharing of the images and people talking about it, and from other countries. There is another way that ideas are being dispersed, and now the piece is traveling from country to country. So then it begins to have another life.
Yeah, very cool.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about emotion. Sorry, just water down the wrong pipe, excuse me. There's a few questions here about asking, beyond creating a contemplative space, can memorials be a happy space? Can you still respect the sacredness of the memorial space, but have a public celebration there? But not a sad one? Is that something that's possible? Absolutely. So let's hear you. Go ahead. You said yes. So.
Yeah, well, I think my minimal definition of a sacred place is any space capable of being defiled is by definition sacred. But even at a site like Oklahoma City, family members will go to the chairs. I don't know if any of you have been, but it's a stunningly powerful memorial with 168 named lighted chairs, smaller chairs for the children who were murdered in the daycare center. Families will go to the chairs for birthday celebrations on Christmas with guitars. So they inhabit those spaces, not remembering their loved ones as a murder victim, but remembering their lives. And I think, look at the Coal Train House. Who couldn't go there and have that as a very cool space?
Right.
So these don't have to be somber places, I don't think.
And I just would say that thinking of HBCU landscapes, there are 105 HBCUs in the United States. Founders Library, again, one of the iconic buildings of HBCUs. That place should be celebrated. It's a sacred space, not only to civil rights and not only to architecture and a symbol of education and freedom in America. And again, it's a space that should be utilized, a place of learning, and a place that we should enjoy, experience, and honor.
Okay, we're running just a little short on time, so I wanted to end with just one question for each of you. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. To just sort of help these teams, if you have one essential piece of advice as they proceed forward in this, just the one thing you want to make sure that they don't forget about, what would that be? Think about it for a second.
The power of memorials to awaken moral imagination.
Beautiful, thank you.
Who's it for? What's the impact that you want that person to receive? And how is that going to change their life?
Janet?
Are you inviting them into an open-ended question, or are you trying to tell them something? And how can you be more open about that?
Fantastic. All right, let's give a huge round of applause for our amazing panels.